They want this repair stage. They want somebody to say, okay, I'm sorry and I'm going to do better. That's literally all they want. They want you just to say, I'm sorry, and just be done with it. We don't need huge apologies. We don't need life stories. We don't need, 5 pages of a book list. We just need, I'm going to do better.
All right, so again, hello and welcome everyone. You've made it to Addressing Microaggressions in Community with the wonderful Crystal Byrd Farmer. So in case we haven't met, my name is Lauren and I'm the program director here at the Foundation for Intentional Community. All right, and now I'm going to introduce today's presenter, Crystal Byrd Farmer. Crystal is an organizer and consultant in the Intentional Communities movement. She serves as co-director for the Foundation for Intentional Community and is on the editorial review board of Communities magazine, published by the Global Eco-Village Network in the United States. She also serves as co-president for the BIPOC Intentional Community Council. In 2020, she published The Token: Common Sense Ideas for Increasing Diversity in Your Organization. Crystal is passionate about encouraging people to change their perspectives on diversity, relationships, and the world. All right, and now I'm going to hand it over to you, Crystal. Thank you so much for joining us today, and over to you.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Okay, so we are going to go over microaggressions. I'm going to share my slides, so I may not be able to see what's in the chat or the Q&A, but I'll try and leave plenty of time at the end for questions. So I'm going to go through the slides. We're going to talk about microaggressions and what those look like, and then how to address them, which is calling in or calling out microaggressions. We're going to talk about some common different types of microaggressions, the common response to calling in and calling out, and then ways that you can do it in a way that maintains the relationship. So the kind of Zoom warnings for me, I have a dog, I have a daughter, and then I have some baby chicks over here. And either any of those might interrupt like what's going on here, or they might make sounds. So just know that that's going on. That's my situation. But I'm going to go ahead and share my slides. So what I want for y'all is to take care of yourselves. Some of the things that I talk about may be triggering, or it may be disturbing. It may, we're going to talk about harm and ways that people feel harmed through microaggressions. But if you need to, you can always, walk away from the screen. You can leave the webinar altogether. I'm always open to feedback, and I'll share my contact information if you do feel like there's something wrong or something that is off or that harms you during this webinar. Another thing to do is to speak from your experience. So I'm the diversity consultant, so I get to say what other people have told me and what we know from research, but oftentimes when we try and tell other people's experience, we get it wrong or we don't have the right context. So I'm encouraging you to speak from your experience if you're going to contribute anything. Avoid describing incidents of harm, including by repeating slurs, and then avoid mentioning people or communities by name. So those are the ground rules for today. The next thing is the definition of a microaggression. So this is a long definition from Racial Equity Tools, the website, which has a glossary and it has lots of different tools and exercises that you can use. But the long definition is the everyday verbal, nonverbal, and environmental slights, snubs, or insults, whether intentional or unintentional, which communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative messages to target persons based solely upon their marginalized group membership. So that's what the long definition is. The short definition for me is any word or action that makes someone feel like the other. And when I say the other, that is usually a marginalized person feeling like their identity is being picked up on and being called out just because they're the only one in the room. So for me, I'm a Black woman. A microaggression for me would be anything that calls out my race, my gender, my sexuality, any assumptions that people make about who I am based on what they think they know about those identity aspects. So a microaggression isn't always a slur or somebody intentionally being mean. A lot of times it's unintentional. A lot of times it's when people are trying to connect with others and be, you know, just kind of be gentle and welcoming, but it can come across as derogatory or ignorant, basically. So it's not always an aggression in that somebody is being intentionally harmful, but it is an aggression in that it causes harm. So that's the definition. These are some examples of microaggressions. There's dozens and dozens and dozens of them. You can Google them to kind of figure out which ones may apply to different races, genders, sexualities, disability. Basically, any marginalized group can have a microaggression, even a non-marginalized group. You can make microaggressions against, you know, a white man, and that can still be harmful because you're making assumptions. So complimenting a non-white person's English, a lot of people who don't speak English as their first language may have somebody say, oh, your English is really good, and that can be a microaggression. Asking where someone is from, and this one is a microaggression because it's saying, oh, you're not from here, where are you from? It's, you know, people are not always intending, you know, to ask where are you from, like you're not trying to give that impression that you're not from here. But if you're asking a you know, somebody who doesn't appear to be white American, then it can have that inference that somebody's not from around here. Using the wrong pronouns for somebody, using slurs or culturally inappropriate words. So the examples I have is the word powwow, which is, you know, a word for indigenous communities of, you know, different types of ceremonial meetings. Calling someone gay or calling something gay is a slur that a lot of young people still use nowadays. Assuming someone is incapable based on their gender, so making assumptions about someone's capability, whether it's, so for me, I worked as an engineer for several years, and I got a lot of assumptions that I wasn't, you know, capable of changing my oil or changing a tire or reading a service manual, you know, just because I was a woman. So that's a microaggression. Asking about scars, injuries, or disability. So when you see people who have an obvious visible disability and you ask them about it, that can be a microaggression. And then talking down to or louder with disabled people. So not all disabled people are hard of hearing or intellectually disabled, but sometimes they experience that. You know, somebody who uses a wheelchair, for instance, may hear fine and, you know, have everything, you know, everything that another person who doesn't use a wheelchair has. But sometimes people approach disability by thinking they have to talk slower, or they have to talk louder, or they have to simplify their words, and that's not always appropriate. So those are examples of microaggressions. If y'all have questions, you can put them in the chat or you can put them in the Q&A. A lot of things, one of the things that I talk about with examples is saying someone's name wrong. And that is a microaggression, often because non-American people or people who have what I call creative names that aren't, you know, what we grew up with in the US. Those can be different for people and people can stumble over them. And it's okay to stumble over somebody's name. It's really important that you try and get people's names right the first time that you meet them and that you talk to them. Because for somebody who doesn't have, you know, that name that everybody is going to be able to remember the pronunciation of, throughout their day, they may face multiple people mispronouncing their name, getting their name wrong, just giving them a completely new name. So they go through that and they encounter multiple microaggressions every day with that. And that's why it's important that you at least be someone who can try and get it right. You know, nobody's expecting perfection, but try and be on the easier side of somebody's life instead of making their lives harder. And that's really the impact of microaggressions, is that they're micro, they're small, but over time they build up and they build up and they build up, and they make life, especially life in community, they make it exhausting. So if you live in a community and people are constantly mispronouncing your name or making assumptions about you or using slurs that are related to your identity, you notice those things, and each one is like a hit to you, and it's just like you never get to rest. And your community, it's supposed to be your home, it's supposed to be the place where you rest, and a lot of people don't get to rest in their homes if they're marginalized groups. And that's why people who are in marginalized groups often don't live in community, because they know they're going to face those microaggressions. And that's why a lot of people leave community. They may not ever tell you that that's why they're leaving, but that's going to be one of the reasons that they leave, because they couldn't put up with the microaggressions, or they decided that it was too exhausting to put up with them. It's really important that people who, they're going to be people who say, well, that's not a microaggression. I'm not offended by it, it's fine. And that's okay. There are people with different levels of resource. This is a new word that I learned, resource, or a new usage of this word. There are people who have a lot of emotional support, who have good mental health, who have all their needs met. And those people are going to be able to, hear microaggressions and brush it off. They'll be able to process it and be fine. There are people who have less resource, so they don't have the emotional support they need. They don't have the resources such as time, money, good housing. They may be stressed out. They may have mental health issues. They may be in a place where they're all getting a lot of other microaggressions all the time. And those people aren't as capable of just brushing off microaggressions. So the impact is going to be harder for them. So that's why you have a range of people who say, oh, well, that's not a big deal to me, to some people who it is a big deal for. It really matters the individual person, where they are in their story, in their life, what their identities are, how those identities have affected their experience of life. And then you always want to, I would say you want to assume that it's going to harm somebody, because by assuming that it doesn't harm anybody, you're gonna miss people, and you're gonna harm these people over here who don't have as many resources. If you assume that it harms, then you can at least apologize. You can figure out, what can I say differently? What can I do differently? And that makes everybody's world better when you do things that are not harmful for anybody. So the other thing is that someone's experience of it is going to be different than what you intended. So this is the impact versus intention. Like I said, a lot of microaggressions are done because people are trying to be welcoming, they're trying to be nice, they're trying to, this happens a lot when you have like that potluck, or like somebody is coming to tour your community. They're trying to find something to connect, like, so they see somebody in a wheelchair, they're like, oh, how did you get in that wheelchair? And it's supposed to be like a really light, great question to get the conversation started. But you're asking somebody about their disability, and that person may not be, willing to tell you what's going on with why they're in a wheelchair. So that's why the intent is different from the impact. You don't always know the situation that's going on, and you may be trying as hard as you can to just find a piece of connection. That doesn't mean that it's not going to harm somebody when you do make that statement or have that connection. So when somebody says that it was harmful or that they didn't like it, that's their reality. That's what your words had on them. It doesn't matter what the context was, what you were trying to do, what you thought, or what you assumed. It's just that you hurt somebody, and now you have to kind of get to a place where you can repair that relationship. And we'll talk about what that means. And then the reality is that most people go along to get along. So not everybody is going to tell you, hey, that was a microaggression. The most common experience for marginalized people is them laughing it off, or just saying, oh, whatever. They're not going to react in any kind of negative way, because well, I'm going to talk about this later, but there's a reason that you can't always say, hey, that wasn't cool, or that was a microaggression, because their housing may be at risk, their job may be at risk, their lives may be at risk. If I'm facing somebody who has more privilege and more power, for me to say, hey, you did something wrong, that's risky. And that may not work out so well for me. So a lot of times I'm just going to laugh it off and just going to roll my eyes or something like that. So a lot of times you're not going to hear from the marginalized people who have microaggressions, because they know that addressing it will cause all these reactions that I'm going to go over. It'll cause this negative response, and it'll come back on them instead of it being a learning moment for the other person. All right, I'm going to pause and look at the questions. When is it a microaggression to ask someone who appears to have a disability if there is any assistance that they would appreciate? So I think it is nice to ask somebody if they need help. It's better to ask. It's not okay to assume it and to just go and ask them for help, or start helping without their consent. So I think you always want to assume competence. So you want to assume that somebody, for instance, using a wheelchair, or somebody using a cane, any physical disabilities, or whatever you're looking at, assume that they are out in the world and they're doing their thing, just like any other person. They probably, if they need help, then they may ask. They may have somebody who's a support person for them, but you don't have to assume that everybody who's using a wheelchair needs your help. But if you want to ask, I think it's okay to ask. I think it's okay to ask. All right, so now we're going to talk about how to address a microaggression. So addressing a microaggression is called a call in or a call out. And these are two sides of the same coin. It's telling someone that what they did was harmful. And there's different approaches to it. So in our world, we've become what they call cancel culture. So it's gotten really, really toxic in a way that makes call outs kind of a negative thing. But calling in was meant to be like kind of the more nice way of doing it. But either way, calling in and calling out is not always a negative thing. It's not a shaming thing. It's meant to help somebody learn. And the two sides that we do a call in, and the way I define it is calling in is like bringing someone close and saying, hey, I know you care about people. I know you're a respectful person. I know you're a good person, but what happened was not okay. So that's like pulling them in. A call out is often pushing them away and saying, you did a bad thing, and now you need to pay for it. That's kind of the tone that those two things have. So a call in, but you can choose to do either one. A call in can be better because it preserves the relationship, right? It doesn't push someone away. It doesn't shame them. It gives them some time to say, well, I don't understand, I don't know what I did wrong. And, when you're calling someone in, you're there to explain and to say, this is what happened and this is why, and here's some resources for you. So that helps the person instead of just pushing on them and saying, hey, you did something wrong. A call out, like when I think of call outs, I think of Twitter and how you just write that, oh, XYZ said this. Wasn't there Scott Adams? He was just, canceled like a couple of weeks ago. So, it's like saying this person did this and they are a bad person. And that's kind of like the extent of a call out. It doesn't give that person an opportunity to be in connection with somebody and say, but I don't know what I did wrong. I don't understand. Tell me what's going on. I think people want to learn, and I think somebody needs to be the person who can help that person learn. I don't want it to be the marginalized people. I want it to be allies who help people learn, but there are always opportunities to teach somebody. And so that's why I think when you're doing a call out, you're achieving one purpose, but you're not maintaining that connection. You're telling them that they did something wrong, but you're not helping them understand, and you're not helping them come back and say, okay, I apologize. Now I'm going to do better. which I think the end result of all of this is that we want people to do better. So Leslie asks, isn't curiosity generally a good thing? For instance, if you ask someone with an accent where they're from, it might be a way to build connection. So there is a certain way, and there's a certain way that a certain privilege that I think us Americans and especially white Americans take, in that they're entitled to information about people. And that just because someone is different, now they get to be curious about that person and ask them about their life story and where they're from. I experienced that when I was in Russia for 6 weeks. You know, I was different. I was a Black person in Russia where there's not a whole bunch of Black people. And people wanted to ask, where am I from? Who are my parents? You know, do I live in Atlanta or do I live in a big city? You know, is my family poor? And it may be curiosity on one person's end, but on the other person's end is invasive questioning. And I think it's important to kind of understand the experience of somebody who is walking into a room already knowing that they're different from everybody else. They already probably have insecurity about their accent, giving away that they're from someone else. And they may be worried about whether they're speaking English in a way that's understandable. They may be worried about, you know, is their family going to cope? You know, they may have just come to the US or they may be in the US, and they don't necessarily want people to suddenly give them the 5th degree about that. Now, I think it's okay to be curious about, like, if, you know, somebody's coming to a co-housing community, what brought you to co-housing? Why are you interested in co-housing? You know, things like that. And that can bring some of your life story into it. It's going to, of course. But to go to the one person who has something different about them and then start questioning them. I mean, do you do the same thing with people who don't have an accent? So I think it's just a kind of a level of understanding that this person is coming into the room with these identities that are already different. They don't need that kind of examination. So that's that answer to that question. How can you best call someone in when you are a white cisgender heterosexual? So if you are one of the normies, as they call it, there's good ways to do it and there's bad ways to do it. I think I have some examples in a later slide, but I think the best way is just to say, you know, I'm not sure that that's a good way to say it, or that was a good thing to do. Or you can say, you know, I've heard from people that that's a harmful word, or that's a harmful question to ask people. You know, when you are not representing that identity, you're an ally, right? And so allies are responsible for kind of bringing in that extra knowledge and saying, hey, you know, this person may not say it, but I know that, you know, for instance, people who use wheelchairs, they don't like their wheelchairs being pushed, you know, just without consent. So you can say, hey, this is what I've learned, and I'm sharing this information with you because I care about you, and I think you're a good person, and I don't want you to make this mistake again. And then chat. Yeah, so Linda says, asking if someone needs help is different than asking them to describe what might be the most traumatic day of their life. Exactly. So asking why are you in a wheelchair is different from asking, hey, do you need any help? And then Susan wants to talk about the Coho listserv and how to handle microaggressions on listserv. So we'll talk a little bit about that when I get to that slide about examples. All right, so this is an important thing to remember. Calling in and calling out requires emotional labor, requires that resource. It requires that you be in a place where you have the energy to educate somebody, you have some knowledge, you have some confidence even. So that's something that a lot of marginalized people aren't going to have every single day. So the experience of marginalization means that you are spending emotional energy that privileged people are not spending. So for instance, if we talk about men versus women and non-binary people. So because women are the marginalized group, they often have to spend a lot of energy counteracting biases, correcting assumptions, doing things that people don't expect that they can do. interacting with people who are making these assumptions about them. And so that means that when they hear a microaggression, it's just another thing on their plate that they have to deal with. And that means that they may not have the same energy, they may not have the same niceness that they can just say, oh, well, that was a microaggression. That's where allies come in, right? So one of the examples that I'm going to have is men versus women. So if there's an ally who can say, hey, that was a microaggression, that takes away that one task that person has to do. And that's why I'm asking people to be allies and say, you have to do the calling in and calling out, because marginalized people already have this big pile of work that they're doing just in their everyday relationships and work. And then, like I said, calling out somebody can cost your job, and cost your housing, and cost relationships. And sometimes we can't risk that, So if my boss is making a joke about me being a woman, do I stand up to him? It might feel good for a minute, but then I might get a bad review. And we know that happens because, this is the real world. This is not, some sitcom or drama TV show where people can just stand up and not have consequences. Do you remember Love Actually, the movie, and when the prime minister character kind of stands up and gives it to the US president? That doesn't happen in real life. Why? Because the US has a lot more power and influence than Great Britain. So sometimes we can't do that. And that's where allies come in, and they can step in and say, hey, I do have some power, I have some social capital, and I can say it without risking those things. And then the other thing about this is that you can choose when to call someone in and call someone out. It doesn't always have to happen when something happens. And for marginalized people, it's usually, when they're on the spot, it's even more difficult to call someone out in the moment. So for you, you can have time, you can have space, you can think about, how am I going to address this? You can look up some resources, you can ask a friend, you can even check in with the marginalized person, which is something that I recommend doing as well. You can check in with that person and say, hey, do you want me to address this or not? And then they can say yes or no. But you can take the time, and then you can go and address it the way that you feel like is best. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about why we don't often call people in or out. It's because we get this stages of response. We get this really, really aggressive, sometimes emotional response to someone calling you in and calling you out. So the first stage is shock. And that's when somebody is like, are you saying that I'm racist, I'm sexist, I'm homophobic, I'm misogynistic? Are you saying that because I committed a microaggression, I'm this terrible person? There's a shock. And then there's the anger, where people react negatively and say, well, I'm a nice person, I didn't mean it that way. You're making all these assumptions about me that I'm a bad person, blah, 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 blah. And another stage that you might get to, that a lot of people get to, is this sadness, where they're like, oh my God, I didn't mean it at all. I'm so sorry. Please give me all the books to read. Please tell me which documentaries to watch. They might bring in the fact that they have a Black son or a Black husband, or that their children are friends with their, they might give their life stories saying, oh, I grew up with a bunch of white people and I never had any Black people to tell me these, so there's going to be this kind of like and this is a very like intense stage where people are wanting to be told that they're a good person and that everything is okay. And, when this is happening to a marginalized person, often the marginalized person is thinking, okay, please stop. They're just like, I didn't sign up for all of this. I just told you that you said something racist. They don't want this life story. They don't want all this emotional labor to be happening. They want this last stage. They want this repair stage. They want somebody to say, okay, I'm sorry, and I'm going to do better. That's literally all they want. They want you just to say, I'm sorry, and just be done with it. We don't need huge apologies. We don't need life stories. We don't need, 5 pages of a book list. We just need, I'm going to do better. When you are the ally, I think it's okay to sit with somebody going through these stages and to kind of help them through it and to give them the resources, or to tell them, no, you are a good person. You're not racist at all. You know, it's okay to do that for somebody, to give them that emotional support, because I think sometimes people need it. But it's not okay to put that on the marginalized person to do. So this is, I call it the turnaround. These are the ways that people usually respond to being called in or called out. So they talk about their proximity to marginalized people. So this is when somebody will talk about, for instance, I just talked about going to Russia. They'll talk about when they went on a trip to Africa or to, somewhere in the global South. They'll talk about the people who are in their lives that have a disability, or that are Black or BIPOC, or people who, have had things said to them, has slurs said. They may talk about, my best friend is gay. And there's a problem with these expressions and saying these things. And the problem is that you're saying, hey, I know this person, or this person is in my life. That means I'm not racist, I'm not sexist, I'm not homophobic. When in reality, you just hurt somebody. So you are a little bit, or at least you said something that was not okay. Just because you know somebody doesn't mean that you know the right things to say, or that you're doing the right things. So please don't ever assume that just because you have a diversity of people in your life that you are a good champion of diversity. You have to do the work within yourself. You have to know the terms. You have to learn all the definitions. You have to understand the experiences of marginalized people very closely, not just through kind of a screen of this person who comes over every once in a while. Another thing that people do is asking for help or resources. Like I said, I think this is perfectly okay if you're an ally, but if I'm somebody who is saying, hey, you just said something racist, it's not okay to ask me for, 5 books that they should read. You can Google that. I mean, actually, you should read my book, The Token. I need to put that in the chat, The Token. But for other people, just because we're Black doesn't mean we have an encyclopedia of all the, anti-racist resources. People like me, like diversity consultants, we do have those resources. So you should go and find somebody who has those resources, who has identified themselves as an educator, instead of just asking the random person, that you offended to tell you what to do and what to learn. Another thing that happens is critiquing somebody's tone or approach. Like I said, if you don't have a lot of resource and you're tired and somebody, insults you, for you to, you're not always going to be the nicest person when you say, hey, that was a microaggression, or that hurt me. You might be mad and say, and curse or do something else. And for somebody to say, oh, well, that was mean, so it doesn't count. That's just not the real world, So if somebody's expressing that they were harmed, you have to believe them, and you have to have some grace around them saying that they were harmed in a way that isn't always perfect, isn't polite, isn't, the nicest way, or the picture perfect 5-paragraph essay about their harm. They're harmed, they're hurt, and they are saying it in a way that's real and authentic for them. So you should just accept that, and you have to kind of think about, how can I receive that and process it, and then come back to maintain that relationship. So, and then giving their life story as an excuse for ignorance. So like I said, sometimes people will talk about their lack of experience with a person with a certain aspect of identity, and that is no excuse for ignorance. We live in the world of 2023, cancel culture is out there, but there is a certain baseline of knowledge that we want people to start having. Yeah, so that's that. The title turnaround is confusing after reading the bullet points. Thank you for that feedback. All right, so this is my slide on how to actually respond. So, you're gonna wanna go through those stages of response, right? Like even I go through it when somebody calls me out. I still have all of that going on in my head, but I don't have to externalize that. If somebody calls me out, I'm gonna take a breath. I'm gonna say, I'm sorry. I'm going to try to say I'm sorry, and I'm going to try to stop talking. I think a lot of marginalized people want you to stop talking is go away, you know, like you hurt me. I really don't like it. I don't need anything else from you right now. You know, you both need to process it. So, you know, for you, go and find some allies, go find some resources and learn and understand what happened. You know, the marginalized person can go and find their resources and get their support and get, you know, and heal up from that. But don't be the person who asks for emotional labor from somebody who has called you out, unless they're an ally and they're saying, hey, I'm here for you. I'm going to explain what happened and I'm going to support you in understanding and growing. And then remember that your discomfort is a chance to grow. This stuff is not comfortable. It doesn't always have a happy ending. You know, you might come back and apologize to somebody and they may not accept your apology, or they may just kind of like be dismissive of your apology. That doesn't mean that your apology wasn't real and that your work isn't done. It means that you did what you had to do. You know, there's no obligation on the marginalized person to forgive you, but there is an obligation for you to at least say, I recognize what I did and I'm going to do better. All right, here's my part on simple ways to do a call out. So you can say, I don't think that's funny. Did you mean to say it that way? There's oops and ouch. And I really like oops and ouch because those are just like markers. They're like darts in a conversation. You don't even have to explain what you're oopsing or ouching about. You can just say oops, and then everybody's going to be like, what happened? You know, and they're going to start thinking about it. And that can be the beginning of a conversation. It doesn't have to happen at that moment. It may not ever happen, but when you point out something and you do it in just a really under the radar way, the people who are paying attention are going to be like, what was that? Did I do something? Did somebody else do something? And that kind of grows your critical thinking skills and helps people to kind of understand more about what's going on. You can say that's not okay. And joking is always a good way to kind of diffuse these situations. The examples I'm going to give you are some jokes that one of them, what was it? No, the examples are not jokes, but you know, like an example, I'll wait until we do the examples, but lighthearted jokes are a good way. So the next 2 slides are examples, and one is about women and the other one is about a name pronunciation. So there's a slight content warning, not that these are, I think, super offensive, but I think they can be offensive. So that's my warning for this. And then we'll take questions after this. So Jane, Bob, and Tony work in an office together. And Jane says, Bob, I asked for your report yesterday. And then Bob says, calm down, I got it. And then he whispers, somebody must be on their period. And then Tony, he makes a joke. He says, wow, is it 1950? That's not okay. So he called it out in the moment. He did a little bit of a joke and he said, clearly, that's not okay. And then Bob got defensive, as most people will, and just said, it was just a joke. I didn't mean anything by it. But Tony is holding his line by saying it was disrespectful and I don't like it. And that sends the message to Bob, you know, this kind of joking is not okay. Now, Tony didn't do a lot of education in this moment. He could have, but I think, you know, for issues like this, it's pretty clear why it's not okay. Or maybe it's not clear. If it's not clear, then somebody can Google it. The next example is about Bob and Hua. And so Bob says to Hua, how do you say your name? And she says, it's like Hua. And then Bob says, Hua, like watermelon. I'll just call you Susie. So this is a common microaggression that people experience when they make fun of their name, or they change their name, or they, you know, they change their name and call them something different because it's too hard to pronounce a, you know, so-called foreign name. So Tony comes back later and says, I don't think Hua liked you joking about her name. And again, he's not doing a lot of education. He's just saying, hey, this is not okay with me. and Bob is, rolling his eyes. So what's going on here? The relationship is still the same. Bob is probably not going to break up with Tony or break ties with Tony because he's making these statements. He's just going to be like, okay, well, I have to be careful what I say around Tony. And that's kind of what we want, right? We want people to be careful what they say. Okay, best practices. Let me go and close my door. So my best practices is, if you know it's a microaggression, assume that somebody's going to feel harmed by it. You may not see the person in the room. You may not ever get a chance to ask them if they felt harmed by it. But I think the best practice is just to assume that it's going to cause harm. And even if the person is not in the room, allowing people to make jokes about someone's sexuality or their gender or their race, or to use words that are harmful, if you don't call it out, or if you don't educate that person, they may go and do it in front of somebody who it is going to harm. So always assume that if you hear something harmful, that there's a way that you can fix it. Check in with people before acting. So it is always helpful to, even if it's just a glance, eye contact, something with the marginalized person. It can go all the way up to asking them, hey, are you okay? Do you want me to say something? I think it's really important to check in instead of just jumping in, because jumping in sometimes can give the impression that you are performative, that you're doing it because you want that person to see you calling somebody out. But by checking in with them, you're saying, hey, I respect that you have a choice in how you respond to this, and I'm going to respect your choice, and I'm going to do what you think is best. So if I'm a Black woman and somebody said something about my race, and if there was a white ally who just kind of looked at me and just kind of like glanced at me, and I kind of nodded or shook my head, that tells me this person is on my side, this person respects me, and this person is ready to fight for me. I kind of like that. They're ready to fight for me. If I look around and somebody has said something, and I look around and nobody is looking at me, nobody's acknowledging me, then I think, okay, this room doesn't have any allies in it. This has happened before. I've looked around and been like, wow, nobody's going to say anything. And even afterward, nobody's going to say anything. It just feels bad. Offer resources if you have the spoon. So like I said, if you are going to be an ally, you're going to do the calling out, then sometimes you're going to be with somebody who needs some education and needs some more support. So always kind of be aware of how much support you can give before you do a call in or call out, because you're a person too, just because even if you're not marginalized, it doesn't mean that you don't have days where you have low energy and you don't have the ability to do this work. It's always about self-care. Diversity work is always about self-care. And then prefer relationship over being correct. So, Tony, in those two examples, he might have done that months apart. If he was doing it days apart, or if those were on the same day, then we would get tired of Tony pretty quick. We wouldn't be friends with Tony because he's just always going to be that one person doing that thing. So you don't have to call everything out. I would say use your best judgment on what is like really egregious versus what is okay, or what you don't know is okay. Calling everything out makes you the annoying person, but it also tires you out. So even I, diversity consultant work, I don't do this every day. I'm not calling everybody out every single day. Again, it goes back to self-care. Sometimes you just have to let it go and hope that somebody else calls it out another time. Oh, okay, so that's it. So I'm going to look at the questions in the chat, and you can add questions to the, students. Okay, sorry. You can add questions to the Q&A, and then we can talk a little bit about listservs and how to respond to that. So spoons is a disability term. So spoons is a word for energy level. So if somebody doesn't have a lot of spoons, that means they don't have a lot of energy to get through whatever they need to get through. So for instance, if I am having a low spoons day and somebody does a microaggression against me, I may just be like, whatever, and walk away. But if I have a lot of spoons, I can say, hey, I didn't like that, or that wasn't okay. And this is why, so when I have more spoons, I have more energy and more resource to address something. It's a term used in the disability community to indicate how much somebody is able to kind of get through their day.
Thank you for that answer, Crystal. I see Leslie has a hand raised. So Leslie, if you'd like to go ahead and unmute and ask your question, feel free.
Yes. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. So I was in a situation once where I asked a person who was non-binary what pronouns they would like me to use, and that person got angry at me for asking. And I know that this is a question that I would only normally ask of people who are of a gender that I can't discern right away. So I wanted to know how I could approach that.
Yeah, that's a great question. So it is, it can be something that people are sensitive about because they know that you're only asking because you don't know. So a good way to approach it is to, especially if you live in a community, is to normalize the use of pronouns. So normalize introducing yourself with your pronouns. And then for very specific, in that very specific example, instead of asking, what are your pronouns? You say, hey, I'm Crystal, my pronouns are she, her. And then they have the option to give you their pronouns or not. In the queer community, there is a little bit of a divide over whether you should ask for people's pronouns or not, because some people who are non-binary are not out and they don't want to publicly use they, them pronouns. And so by asking, you may be outing them. And so that's where the complexity comes in. So it's just best, instead of asking, what are your pronouns, just say, these are my pronouns. And this works the same way when you're doing names, say, this is my name, and then somebody can give their name so that you can, hear the name without asking them how to pronounce it again. And then a slur. So what is a slur? A slur is a word that is offensive to a certain identity group. So it's hard to define it without using a slur. So the N word is a slur. Calling something gay is a slur. Any kind of word or phrasing that shows that a group is less than or is not the norm is a slur. What else?
There's a comment from Trista that says, I would like to mention assuming someone's gender identity based on your observation / perception of them could also be a microaggression.
Yes, yeah. So you don't want to assume someone's gender identity. You do want to either ask their pronouns or, like I said, introduce yourself with your pronouns, or just ignore it. You don't always need to know what gender a person is. I mean, yeah. How to discuss race with a person of a different race. Don't. So it's really, so this is another thing that comes up with white people, especially, is that they find race really, really interesting and just something totally foreign to them, and they want to ask a lot of questions about it. Whereas a lot of people who are non-white, we talk about race all the time. We discuss it every day. We know the impact it has on our life. We're not necessarily open to sharing about who we are with you. And so it's really important that you are not presuming that you are good enough friends or close enough to a person to talk about their race. Don't be that person. You can always ask, is it okay to talk about race with you? But you also have to be okay with that person saying no. Because oftentimes when we say yes, we get jokes, we get assumptions, we get all these things that are harmful to us. I've never said yes to somebody and then been pleasantly surprised at what they said. So I would say most of the time you don't want to talk about race with somebody because you probably don't know the depth of your ignorance. And it's perfectly okay to seek out understanding, to watch documentaries, to Google it, to watch YouTube, to learn about as much as you can before you start having those conversations with people. So, okay, comment on the practice of code switching. Is it okay to say things in one context and not another? Yes, I think so. So, you know, I talk about race, I joke about race, I joke about queerness, but that's because I know that the people that I'm with are okay with those jokes. You know, I don't do that in what they call polite company. So I think code switching is important. It's important to know who you're around, but it's always better to err on the side of caution, to assume that what you say is going to offend somebody. And that if it does offend somebody, that you're prepared to apologize. Okay, listserv. Okay, but before I do the listserv, age or employment status is definitely cause for microaggression. Like I said, white men can have microaggressions against them. So people who are a certain age, whether they're older or they're younger, whether they look older or younger, can be a microaggression. Employment status, people can make assumptions about, you know, where somebody lives, where somebody works, what they're capable of, all these things. There's lots of different identities that microaggressions can be done against. All right, so there is a co-housing listserv, which is a mailing list thing. And there was some words said by a white person who was relaying an experience that they'd had of a Black pastor talking about why Black people wouldn't want to live in co-housing. And he used some words that were offensive to Black people and made assumptions that I felt like weren't okay about how Black people would get along in co-housing. And so the way that people responded is kind of like the very textbook microaggression, you know, stages of response that I usually see. So there was, you know, first people saying, hey, that's not okay. And then there was people saying, well, he was just explaining. And then this person kind of doubled down on saying, well, this is a person that I know, and they, you know, they said this because, you know, X, Y, Z. So again, they were using their proximity to a Black person, right, to justify the use of their language. And then they were also talking about the intent. You know, I wasn't intending to offend anybody. I was just saying, and again, it doesn't matter what the intent of it was. If it's harmful, it's harmful. And he apologized, and there was some back and forth about how to apologize. And I think any apology, any attempt at apology is a good apology, but there definitely can be ways that you can acknowledge what you've done, and then the ways that you don't acknowledge what you've done. You can say, hey, I'm sorry if I hurt somebody. Again, there's that if in there, like if I hurt somebody, I didn't mean it this way, but if I did, okay, I'm sorry. And then there's the apology. I apologize for harming you. I apologize for what I did. I know that it caused harm. So that's the acknowledgement, right? That's the saying that I did this and I saw that it harmed somebody, and now I'm going to do better, instead of being like, oh, well, if somebody was hurt over here, then, you know, that's their problem. It's not their problem. It's everybody's problem. And that was a thread that was very painful and very frustrating for me. Any other questions or comments before we wrap up? Oh, so this is part of the diversity course that I do for FIC. It starts April 1st. We have like 2 hours of white supremacy culture, microaggressions, calling in, calling out, And then the rest of the course is about different aspects of identity. So race, gender, sexuality, disability, age, and socioeconomic status. And I go into and define all of those different aspects of identity and talk about common microaggressions, talk about common issues that people face, and then ways that those identities can be more included in community. So that is how the course goes, and I hope that you sign up for it. There's early bird until Sunday, and yeah.
Well, wonderful. Thank you, Crystal. I'm amazed at how much you can fit in a short amount of time. So thank you so much for presenting such really important information in such a clear way. And, you know, as well for letting us pick your brain as well. Really appreciate your time and knowledge on this topic. And I'm grateful for all of you here that engaged with this. And if we don't see you in the upcoming course, we hope to see you in Zoom land again soon. So please take care.